Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy that you're here as we dive into this important topic of business continuity. At Kirkpatrick Price, our goal is to educate, empower, and inspire our clients to greater levels of assurance, and we hope that this webinar helps you prepare to face threats and impacts to your business. My name is Lindsay Culbreth, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Kirkpatrick Price, and I'll be your host for today's session. It's going to be a really insightful session as we learn about getting ready for business continuity. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees will be muted throughout the session. If you have a question, please use the questions box, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. If you would like CPE credit for the webinar, you can send an email to hello@kirkpatrickprice.com, and we'll happily send you a CPE certificate for that. And finally, this session is being recorded, and we'll send everyone a link to the webinar recording, so be on the lookout in your inbox for that tomorrow. Now, at Kirkpatrick Price, we know when it comes to threats, you want to make sure that you're ready. In order to do that, you'll need quality cybersecurity and compliance audit reports with results you can trust. The problem is that audits are hard because the process is complicated and it feels overwhelming. But we believe if you're going to do it, the audit should be worth it. We've been in your shoes and know how hard audits can be. But we've issued over 10,000 reports to 1,200 clients around the world, giving them the assurance they deserve. We'd like to encourage you to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our monthly newsletter, The Readiness Report, so we can partner with you to help you meet your challenging compliance goals. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Todd Atnip is a certified IT and security professional with 38 years of experience in multiple technology disciplines and industries. In addition to many years of hands-on and leadership experience in software development, networks, data management, and strategic consulting, Todd has more than 10 years of executive IT experience as a VP and CIO. Todd works with Kirkpatrick Price clients in an advisory role, helping them build sustainable, best practice information security programs. Welcome to the webinar, Todd.
Thank you, Lindsay, and a big good afternoon welcome from Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm located. We're glad all of you are here, and I'll say good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good morning, depending on where you're joining from. But we're glad to have you here for this really important topic. The fact that you've taken time out of your day to join this means that you care about it, and that means a lot to us because we care a lot about these topics as well. And this is an important one. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. I want to spend a few minutes of time talking about the threat environment. It's important that we know what we're up against collectively as business owners, as cybersecurity professionals, as IT professionals, when it comes to what are we solving for. And so we'll spend a few minutes with some numbers that'll have some shock value associated with them, so that, you know, if you're not already paying attention, you will based on some of these numbers. Then we're going to discuss the key concepts and best practices behind business continuity planning and disaster recovery. We're only going to spend about 40 to 45 minutes talking about this, and if we have some time, we'll do some Q&A at the end, but that's not going to leave a lot of time to delve into level 5 detail. We'll keep things at a conceptual level 1, level 2 type of detail for a session like this. We're going to spend some time talking about cloud computing and BCP and the relationship there, and how maybe cloud computing can be a part of your solution for business continuity and resilience in general. And then we'll recap what we've discussed. And again, if we have a little time at the end, we'll answer some questions. So with that, let's just dive right in and start with the threat overview piece of this. $8 trillion. As you can see from the source, that's an estimate of the 2023 estimated global cost of cybercrime. That's a staggering number. obviously, and even if they're off by 50%, that would still be a staggering number in their estimates. Just to put a little context behind that, so you kind of get a sense for how big that number is, that represents probably the greatest transfer of economic wealth in human history. It's also exponentially larger than the damage inflicted from all natural disasters in a year worldwide. And then if we keep it in the realm of crime, which is what we're talking about here, that number would be more profitable than the global trade of all major illegal drugs combined. So you can see this is a big problem. And big is not even the right word. It's astronomical when you get right down to it, and it's getting worse. And the big sad thing here is that $8 trillion represents an enormous amount of opportunity cost. The things that are not getting done that are valuable for your businesses is the real tragedy in this. They're having to be spent trying to fight issues like this out in the cybercrime world. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about ransomware. This is both a mature and emerging threat. There's new attack vectors in this space appearing almost daily by some analysts' projections. And it's also projected from a numbers perspective that this will cost annually about $265 billion with new attacks to both consumers and organizations. And the same analyst is estimating that there's a new ransomware attack generated against an organization or individual about once every 2 seconds somewhere in the world. So this is a serious, timely problem. New payloads are appearing, zero-day payloads are appearing constantly. And just to have a little fun with this, again, to kind of put in perspective what that $265 billion represents. I know you've all heard the anecdote, right? That if you stacked a billion $1 bills one on top of another, that would be about 68 miles up into the atmosphere. The real atmosphere ends at about 62 miles, so it goes beyond our known atmosphere. Now, if you multiply that by 265, you would get about 18,000 miles instead of the 68. Now, just to give you a little bit of context for that, and again, we're having a little fun with this one, that graphic right there represents kind of the geosynchronous orbit of all the communication satellites. And those are out there at about 20,000 miles into space. And the $265 million bills stacked one on top of each other would be about 18,000 miles. So you kind of get a sense for, in a fun way, kind of how big this problem really is. A couple more slides that I want to go through to talk about threats. In a sense, I hate to even bring this one up, but I feel like I have to because it's so front and center right now. The emergence of AI into the mainstream, it's kind of on this blistering pace right now. A year ago, this was a fad. And it's now kind of this global phenomena that seems to have unlimited potential. Unfortunately, cyber criminals are also very aware of the capabilities and benefits of AI, and new threats are emerging that are taking advantage of technologies like machine learning to evade a lot of the protective measures that you may or may not have in place, right, in your networks, in your software. It's potentially a game changer on the cybersecurity front. The sky's the limit right now with this. And if you combine this with the emergence of quantum computing, I mean, who knows? Just as an aside, quantum computing is another one of those technologies that's kind of taken on an astronomical leap in capability. We're developing it here. They're developing it in Asia. They're developing it in Europe. Once this becomes enabled, we're going to have to completely rethink the whole science of cryptography. That's the encryption stuff that you hear about and that you apply to data that's in transit and at rest. Right now, with even our strongest supercomputers, it takes millions of years to brute force attack a strong key. but with quantum computing realized that will be reduced to a matter of hours. Now you combine that with artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. I mean, who knows what could be done on both the good and the bad fronts. So I bring this one up simply because I wanted to have a little bit of a flavor of what's emerging right out there that we need to pay attention to. Again, there's good and bad associated with artificial intelligence, but we need to be aware of both. And then finally, last but not least, I want to discuss a little bit of what I think is the most solvable, but sometimes the most neglected threat to good business continuity plan enablement in organizations, and that's organizational disconnect. I want to show you a number, then I want to compare it to another number. The first number I want to show you based on, again, a survey done by Cybersecurity Ventures. 92% of business executives agreed that their business continuity strategy was informed by risk management. In other words, they had done risk management, they had applied risk management to their business continuity strategy and decided that it was being paid attention to at the proper level. So in other words, almost 100% of business execs surveyed said, yeah, we've got this handled. Now I'll give you a second to kind of think, if I applied that same question to not business executives, but maybe to other leaders in the organization who were responsible for the implementation of the controls associated with business continuity and disaster recovery, what would their answer be to that same question about a risk-based approach to business continuity? You got your number? Well, this was the actual number. Only 55% of the cybersecurity leaders agreed. So if you've got almost 100% of the business executives thinking that this is handled properly, and only half of the rest of the organization who really is down in the weeds with it and knows what's going on think that, then that's something that's got to be solved, right? You can't have this big gap in expectation between your business leaders and those responsible for implementing the controls. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a position where your priorities and your policies maybe don't match up. And I want to say one other thing here as an aside on this, not directly related to this, but still part of the disconnect thing. There's another point of disconnect that I hear about all the time, and I want to talk about for just a second. I hear from business owners and executives all the time that they struggle to spend like precious resource time on these types of what they call non-revenue generating activities, which as a consultant, I find confusing because I think, well, you spend time and money on all kinds of activities that are not revenue generating in your business. IT, for example, is an enabling function to revenue generation in your business, but not necessarily directly involved in the revenue generation process. Think about these types of processes and controls like BCP as not revenue generating and maybe not revenue enabling, but they are revenue protecting. If you're one of those business leaders on this webinar, think about it in that context and take that to heart. If you're one of those cyber leaders, maybe that's having trouble getting attention on this topic and struggling for a way to get both attention and funding and to put the right controls in place, then maybe try that approach, right? The revenue protecting idea. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the threat landscape. We could talk all day about the enormity and the scope and the scale of the threat landscape out there. But the main thing I want to leave you with is the idea that it's huge. It's getting worse, and there's new types of threats emerging every day. So the idea that you can recover from something that is going to happen eventually is important. All right, so let's dive right into some of the detail here on business continuity and disaster recovery. So let's start with what is it? You need a definition that resonates with the enterprise is the first thing I would say, and the differing perspectives that people would come to this topic with. Over the years, this is one that I've liked, a deliberate and actionable strategy to ensure service delivery in the event of a major disruptive event impacting essential business function, processes, or technologies. Now, the operative word here is service delivery, particularly when you're trying to convince those senior leaders of the importance of this process in your company. Revenue generation is dependent on service delivery, and every business leader I've ever met and encountered knows this intuitively. Everybody else in the business knows that they're a part of service delivery. So you can get enterprise-wide backing of a definition like this without a whole lot of technical detail. That was what a definition of business continuity. Now we need to talk about what is business impact analysis, because that is the next step, and it is the primary input to inform on how you build your business continuity plan. Business impact analysis is the process of determining the criticality of business activities and associated resource requirements to ensure operational resilience and continuity of operations during and after a business disruption. That's a fancy way to say you need to understand what it is you're protecting and what the impact is of those things that you're protecting and how long it's going to take you to recover from particular outages, and what are the expectations for how you recover from an outage. So that's what it is. Why is it important? You can't effectively protect what you don't understand. The BIA, or business impact analysis, helps you kind of put guardrails around the various wants and desires of the key stakeholders in the business. Essentially, it's the ability to effectively prioritize activity when executing a business continuity and disaster recovery plan. Additionally, it assesses and informs on recovery time requirements like recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, which we'll address later. These should be performed at function or process levels at least, and sometimes at an asset level. A key outcome of this activity is reconciling any disagreements on recovery priorities, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. Most organizations of any size, even smaller organizations, depend on shared resources in the IT space. And the IT space is where a lot of the disaster recovery takes place. So those are the people responsible for helping you recover from a disruption. So in a disaster scenario, who gets their stuff back first? If you have a various and differing service delivery products, you're not going to be necessarily able to recover all of those at the same time with a shared resource like IT. You're going to have to make some decisions about who gets to go first. And that's why this exercise is really important, is you come together, you look at things by department, at a department by department level, and you make some determinations based on maybe some financial metrics you have in the business associated with how much this product generates in revenue per hour versus this product. And you make decisions on who should be recovered first. Again, because you've got this shared resource of IT experts. The second important thing this exercise does is it can reveal any disconnects you have between the business expectations of recovery and the actual capability to meet those expectations. Just a quick example, let's say if you transact, let's say, a large portion of your business via email, and maybe in the Microsoft world, you have a PST file that's 2 terabytes. What you can't do is have the business believing in a 2 to 4 hour recovery time objective unless you've implemented a backup and recovery strategy that aligns with that expectation. It'd be really hard in almost any scenario to recover 2 terabytes in a couple of hours. Physical limitations have to be addressed in terms of recovery time objective and recovery point objective. And those are simply 2 metrics that you'll find coming out of a business impact analysis that help inform everyone else of what the expectations are for how quickly you need to recover any particular asset, process, function, or technology within your business. So what are the key components of a business impact analysis? You're going to talk about financial, operational, and even reputational impact. Reputational is one that sometimes gets forgotten, but you need to make sure you include that. The recovery priorities of your critical functions and processes are included. Quantifying recovery timeframes and the minimum data required to recover would also be part of that analysis. Understanding what resources are needed to actually recover and any dependencies related to anything needed to recover. And again, as we were talking about on that previous slide, gaining that alignment at the enterprise level of who goes first, which things are going to be recovered first. There are no non-critical functions in a business, otherwise you wouldn't be spending time on them. There's most critical and less critical, but they're all critical. Okay, secondly, beyond the business impact analysis, you need a plan. Now, I use the word actionable here because not all plans are actionable. There's a lot of plans that aren't. The business continuity plan, quite simply, it's a framework that contains all the categories of action required to make sure that the essential elements of your service delivery are recovered both timely and effectively. So let's talk about actionable for a second, because this is really important. Write it down in enough detail to be actionable, but not so detailed it's a barrier. You've all seen these plans, right? That sometimes come out of organizations that all they do is sit around and write plans. It's pages and pages and pages of detail that take so long to read and decipher that the damage caused by the disruption continues to stack up to the point where the benefit of all that detail turns into a net negative. It becomes a point of diminishing returns. Said a different way, and this is a good axiom to keep in mind, is perfection is the enemy of good. There are no perfect plans. You need a good plan. Another thing to kind of commit to memory, and I use this all the time when I'm talking with clients about this, is something needs to be actionable but not overwhelming. And that's a subjective idea, but it's something that might be different for everybody. But if you keep that in mind, it'll help you as you're going through the process of building a plan, not to get it so detailed that you can't actually execute on it. Another thing to say about a plan, if someone asks, it's what to do, when it needs to be done, by who needs to do it, and how. Okay, simple terms. So what is in an actionable plan? These are elements that you need to have in general in any disaster recovery and business continuity plan. Clear disaster declaration criteria. Make sure you know, and what I want to say here is make sure you know the difference between an incident and a disaster. Sometimes that's murky, right? They're kissing cousins, but they're not the same thing. An incident might be a malware outbreak inside part of your organization on certain devices that are preventing certain people from getting work done, but you're not down. You're not unable to actually do service delivery. Now, it's also important to point out that sometimes things start out as incidents and graduate to a disaster or business continuity scenario. You need to have criteria in your plan that kind of points out when that point occurs. Role definition, who's your disaster lead? Who's your communications lead? Your technical response team, who's on it in any one particular scenario? Clearly define those roles of who does what. The last thing you need to be going on in the middle of an incident or a disaster is everybody running around looking at each other saying, is that yours or is that mine? Are you in charge or am I in charge? That's, you know, you want a clear definition in your plan of who does what. Communication essentials need to be there. Define all the various ways that communication could or must take place in a particular scenario. Who do I need to communicate with? Is there outside or inside attorneys that need to be involved? Do I need to contact local law enforcement? Or maybe at the federal level, the FBI, depending on what's happened? Do I need to communicate with my customers? And when do I do that? And who should do that? Have all of that thought about and detailed in your plan. Now, the restoration procedures piece, now that is where you're going to have more detail, obviously, to make sure that you can effectively restore technology and business processes and functions. But remember the axiom, keep it in your head. Actionable, not overwhelming. Avoid a scenario where you have too much detail, and the activity around it devolves into this idea of diminishing returns. One recommendation I always make to clients when they ask me this question about how much detail do I need is you've got people at the lowest level of your organization who are the tool jockeys, the guys that turn the screws and hammer the nails, so to speak. They've got their own detailed lists of what they need to do once they're given their marching orders. Let them keep those lists. Those things don't belong in your business continuity plan. That's the kind of stuff that makes those plans overwhelming. Trust your team to know at the lowest level of detail what they need to do without having to spell it out in the general document. Testing cycles. I cannot stress enough the need to test your plan at least annually. Most companies do this with a tabletop exercise. I would, as an analogy, I would say that's kind of like a Hollywood script read where all the actors are sitting around a table and they're just reading through their parts. That's that's kind of a crude example of what a tabletop exercise is. Simulations can be done, and they're easier now that we have the advent of the cloud, but that's usually a lot more involved and time consuming. And generally, it's not required by most audit frameworks that you go to that level of testing. And then finally, detailed dependencies should be a section in your document. This is generally for reference materials that may be needed at some point, like contact lists, technology diagrams, vendor lists, things like that. Putting those things in the appendix helps keep that noise out of the main plan since they're not constantly needed to be referred to like maybe a checklist is. So those are basically the key elements in general that you would find in your disaster recovery business continuity plan. So what are the key assets that you should be concerned about? There are about a dozen or so assets or asset groups that matter, and they fit kind of in four broad categories. Those four categories are technology, people, facilities, and supply chain. I've used this acronym for years and years, even when I was on the other side of the desk running IT organizations where I had to be the person driving these types of things. TPFS, technology, people, facilities, supply chain. Almost every recovery asset or component that we're going to talk about following this fits into one of those areas. Plus, this is a really good device to use in later stages of developing your business continuity plan, so that when your thoughts kind of turn to, I'm almost done and have I covered everything in my plan, you can come back to this acronym TPFS to use as kind of a reconciliation point to say, technology, people, facility, supply chain, did I get it all? And just kind of go through that exercise multiple times as you're developing your plan. Okay, first, technology. Technology components, backup and restore, data file backups, software backups, communications. Let's touch on each one of those just a little bit. Technology assets are exactly what you think they are, right? Infrastructure, hardware, endpoint devices like laptops, tablets, smartphones, handheld devices, et cetera, networks, servers, power facilities, things like that. Those need to be accounted for recovery in your plan. Backup and restore strategies. What media do I use? How often do I do it? What techniques do I need to use? Do I need to use a file-based backup strategy, or should I use an image-based backup strategy? Data file backups. Where do I store them? How do I have access to them? Are they in the cloud? Are they on tapes? Are they on disks? Are they at a facility? Who has access to those? Are they encrypted? What media should I use? What media won't spoil on me, right, over time? Software backups is one that sometimes gets forgotten. Do you have a software escrow with a third party in case you lose your primary source code platform, right, as part of the event? I had a sad situation with a client that was a startup who had a ransomware attack where the primary code repository and their build release platform was compromised, and they never were able to recover it. And that was their only copy of source code. That was a tough one, right? Because there were about 40,000 man hours involved in the development of that code. So consider having more than just a backup of your software in a place that you can access it. Maybe think about escrowing that, because for a lot of you, your source code is your biggest IP and biggest asset that you have. Communications. How will you communicate when primary channels are unavailable? What are all the alternate methods, either voice and non-voice, that you need to have technology for to continue communication in any particular scenario? Moving on to the people side of things. It goes without saying, I think, and I'm going to say it though, first and foremost, you must protect life and limb in a disaster scenario if that's applicable to the situation. The plan must contain elements that ensure this above all else. I think that's probably intuitive to anybody that's listening in, but I wanted to say it to make sure. That said, your plan must also contain features that account for any single point of failure in the people realm. Well, what does that mean? Well, you probably, like most companies, have a few people or that one person holding a lot of critical knowledge in their heads. I've been there. And you don't know the impact of that person being unavailable for an indeterminate amount of time, either for some reason or another. And that actually I have seen graduate with that person unavailable into a business continuity scenario because something failed and that was the only person that knew how to fix it. And it was critical to their service delivery process. So make sure on the people front that you've accounted for single points of failure. Most of the time you've probably, and I've done this too, you've always just kind of crossed your fingers and assumed that person was going to be there because they always have. I like to tell my customers and myself all the time, hope is not a strategy, right? Have a succession plan in place for individuals like that that are critical to your business. On the general support front, and this is something else that sometimes gets forgotten in developing a business continuity plan, depending on what the scenario is, and where people are located and where they have to be based on the type of scenario you're dealing with, there's other non-service delivery things that you need to make sure are available, right? Things like food, water, clothing, shelter, vending, coffee, transportation, sanitation. It's not just about supporting the people who are actually doing service delivery and the systems and functions and processes. It's also the human support that needs to occur in a non-service delivery way with those functions that I just mentioned. Make sure you account for those if needed in your plan. Facilities. If you're a in-person, everyone in the office business model, what do you do when you don't have that, right? You may need a temporary place to call your headquarters or your command center. Because you still have to manage the first two elements at some level that we just talked about, the technology and the people. So it may be important that you have either another location already lined out, already ready for you to move into if you get in a situation where you need a different place to actually call headquarters. A virtual war room will work if you can't occupy a temporary facility, and that's an option you can consider. Work from anywhere was something that a lot of companies were already doing before the pandemic, but it was kind of forced on the world in the 2021 timeframe. So that's been deployed fairly effectively by most companies at this point. Make sure in your plan that all the things that are needed to continue to do that for longer periods of time than would otherwise be expected or desired and done securely are accounted for in your plan. Think about things like VPNs and multi-factor authentication and all those things that are controls that you would expect to be in place for people working remotely. Well, what are geographic considerations? If you live in San Francisco, your plan probably should consider the types of things that occur because of an earthquake as a threat. If you live in South Florida or on the eastern seaboard, you probably need to consider flooding as something you need to account for as a likely scenario on your list. If you have offices or personnel and facilities in volatile locations somewhere in the world, considerations for civil unrest may need to be detailed. Regulatory requirements and a particular location may need to be considered in your plan as well, if you have to temporarily relocate to a different jurisdiction. A lot of things to consider from a geographic and jurisdictional standpoint. Supply chain, and this is the last group. In the past, we thought of supply chain as simply about, getting raw materials from point A to point B so that you could produce a product, service delivery. While that's still true, in 2023, supply chain is now including technology considerations, which are driven largely by the disruptive technology known as the cloud, right? But that also applies to like your traditional technology partners as well, like third-party data centers, co-location facilities, offsite storage facilities. It still applies to all of them. Here's what I want to say that's really important that you make sure you have. Make sure that you have from these supply chain vendors, especially if they are key to your real-time service delivery process, an understanding of their disaster recovery plans, okay? Even better, ask them for a third-party assessment report, like if they're subject to PCI or SOC 2 or HIPAA or NIST or ISO. They should have something documented that says, here is how we recover, right? Not only make sure that they have it, but make sure that they've tested it, okay? We talked about that earlier. Until it's tested, it's an aspiration and an ambition. It's not really a plan. Okay, so let's transition to and talk a little bit about the cloud and business continuity planning. First, I think probably most of you, if you're in the cloud, you know this. There's not a lot of mystery here with cloud computing. I describe it simply means, and other people do this too, it's simply running on someone else's computers. They still have hardware, they still have networks, they still have NIC cards, they still have power requirements, they still have hard drives, they still have all of the same stuff that you would have in your on-premise data center. They're just managing a whole lot of that infrastructure stuff for you. So the thing to remember is it's still a shared responsibility model in the cloud. There's still stuff you have to do, there's stuff that they do. That said, the cloud's attractive because of things like on-demand scaling, multi-zone and multi-region options with the major cloud service providers that have greatly improved the high availability options that you might could take advantage of for your critical business processes. But again, this is not plug and play. It's not set it and forget it. It's a very important point that you remember that when we talk about the cloud. All right, so what are the key things that you need to make sure that you keep in mind when we talk about the cloud? A risk-based approach still applies. Again, not plug and play. You will always need to do risk analysis to make sure that you don't apply too much or too little in the way of controls for your business in the context of business continuity and disaster recovery. I run across lots and lots of businesses who haven't done a proper risk analysis, and they're spending a whole lot of time over here in their business continuity plan with something that's really low risk, and they're not spending any time at all over here that when you look at it would be considered something high risk. So quite frankly, not just for cloud, but for anything that you're doing with business continuity, it needs to be a risk-based approach. To that end, that second point is similar. If you're in the cloud, your cloud service provider is probably going to have a pretty robust BCP DR plan of their own. And you need to make sure you understand the capabilities that they have, where they start and where they end, because depending on what type of cloud situation you have, maybe you're just SaaS and not platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, you may not need to do anything. They may do everything they need to do in a software as a service situation, and you don't need to do anything. It's enough. Don't overspend on things that you can't use or don't need. Make sure you design for high availability. If you are only in the cloud and are not using it just for backup, make sure you understand the differences between the different high availability options that are available to you for business continuity and disaster recovery. Multi-zone may be good enough for you. Your risk assessment may have told you, just a multi-zone is good enough for us. We can have 2 zones in the same uh, East region, for example. But if it's so critical to your business that you need to make sure that you can recover very quickly, then you might want to consider a multi-region strategy in case one particular region of a cloud service provider is unavailable for an unacceptable or long period of time. Be careful with this idea of automatic geographic failover, though. Especially if you're an international company, there may be legal and regulatory requirements you need to understand before implementing a particular solution. It's not just an automatic that you can say, well, okay, well, the Eastern European region is down. I'm just going to flip over to the West US region. There may be jurisdictional and legal requirements that you need to make sure you understand before you do that. Don't fix one problem and create another one that might be worse. And then finally on this, I want to say this. There is no 100% solution. There is a possibility that whether you're in the cloud or not, quite frankly, where you may be down. The trick here is to fail gracefully, right? If you're in business long enough, something beyond your control is going to happen that none of your in-place countermeasures to bring everything back up and running works for some period of time. Don't leave your customers hanging without any idea of what's happened, how long it may be, et cetera. Have a plan in place and detailed in your business continuity that if the unthinkable happens and I am completely down and everything I've tried to bring myself back up isn't happening, have some idea of how do I fail gracefully? What do I do to make sure my customers know that I'm doing everything possible to bring the systems and the services that they depend on back up as quickly as possible? Okay, one more major point here, and then we'll do a quick recap. Test, 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 test. I cannot stress enough how important this is. You need to tabletop test at least annually your business continuity plan. And most audit frameworks require that anyway within the audit period that's being assessed. I would also say on top of that, make sure you test again if there's some type of major business disruption, like I've rolled out a new product line or I've acquired another business. Make sure that you think in terms of, okay, there are business disruptions that occur outside of my normal cycle for testing that I may need to do more than just annually. The other thing that's important to do is not to just test everything. Nobody has time to do that. I touched on this a little earlier, but most relevant scenarios will be teased out of your risk assessment, right? What's the likelihood and the impact of particular risk to your business? Try to find scenarios to test that kind of align with those things that are considered highest risk. Leave those low risk, low likelihood, low impact things down there at the bottom of the list. And if you one day want to just throw one of those in for good measure after you've gotten really mature on all the other stuff, that's fine. If you're high availability in the cloud, there is a way to prove it, right? You can take a small, low risk, low profile part of your service delivery, and you can fail over to your high availability components and make sure it works. I have clients who do this a lot, right? They'll take a client who's a relatively low volume and they'll automatically fail over to their high availability solution in another zone or another region just to make sure it works. That's something that you can do with very little risk, right, to your business. That's one way to simulate failover on a very small scale. Finally, never assume. This is extremely important. By way of example, let's say you have a third-party print shop that fulfills mailers for you, and you also have a backup vendor that uses the exact same print equipment, the exact same software, in almost the exact same setup in another location that you can fail over to if you have to. Now, it's really, really tempting. If you can say to yourself, well, this is a mirror facility, using the same software, same version, same hardware and everything, to just assume if your primary fails, that the secondary should work the way that one does. Don't do that. Pressure test it for real. Find a way, again, as we discussed before in the high availability scenario, take a low risk, low volume client that you inform that you're doing so, and say, we're going to fail your stuff over to this other facility just to make sure that it works. Do not assume things will work just because all other things are equal. Okay, we're near the end here. Let's recap real quickly. This is when, not if. You need to adopt the mindset as an organization that this is going to happen. You will have to enact your disaster recovery plan for some reason. Remember, ransomware attacks are occurring about once every 2 seconds, right? How long is it going to take before they get to you? Okay. We talked, the title of this presentation is Expect the Unexpected. It's really easy, because I do it all the time, is to get lackadaisical about things because so much time passes with everything going well. We're not having any problems. We're making a lot of money. We've got good controls in place. And then that thing that you hoped never would happen happens. It's a when, not if. Okay. Just get that in your head, because that's the world we live in. We talked a little bit about organizational alignment. That must happen. Okay. Get everyone on the same page at all levels. Are you going to find yourself at some level of chaos, disillusionment, and potentially business compromise because senior leadership is not aligned with cybersecurity leadership, and maybe even at lower levels of the organization? Make sure you communicate effectively to make sure everybody's on the same page about not just expected capability, but actual capabilities. Business impact analysis is the baseline for all of this activity, right? You cannot manage what you don't understand. You cannot put a plan in place if you don't know what's most important to recover first. Okay, so make sure that you go through that exercise. That's one of those, cheap anecdotes. Those who fail to plan to fail, right? Put it on paper and remember what we said. Make it actionable, not overwhelming, okay? TPFS, technology, people, facilities, and supply chain. Come back to that often, right? When you're building your plan, use that. Have I covered everything or not? TPFS. If you have a cloud partnership, understand the capabilities of your major cloud service providers and the things that they offer, but also understand the possible risks and possible downsides that could occur, as we discussed earlier, of using the cloud in certain scenarios. And then finally, last point, pressure test the plan. Pressure test the plan. That's last, but it's not least. It is an ambition until it's tested, not a plan. Okay, last slide. This is my one salesy slide that I've got to talk about. If you're looking for somebody to help you with this, and the reason you might be looking for somebody to help you with this is I've gone through this entire presentation, and you look at yourself on the crawl, walk, run, sprint scenario, and you go, whoa, we're not even born yet. We're not even crawling yet. If that's you, then we probably could help you, right? For others of you that have had this stuff in place and you're pretty mature with it, this presentation may have just been validation that you're doing the right things. You may have picked up 1 or 2 tips along the way here that might help you to enhance it a little bit. But connect with us because we can probably help you if you're in a scenario where you just don't know where to start, or maybe you just need somebody to review where you are and see if it's good. We can do it a lot of different ways and insert ourselves in a lot of different points in your process and in your walk with this stuff. All right, Lindsay, back to you. See if we have any questions that have come up through the course of this. I'll be glad to answer them. I think we still have some time.
Yep, we do. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Todd, that was extremely helpful and informative, so thank you for sharing your knowledge. The first question is, how do you ensure that the vendors you depend on are actually doing the things they should to maintain their own recovery processes?
That's a great question. And it's one that, well, I'll put my compliance hat on for a second, answer that question. As a service organization, you have every right in the world to demand, and that's a strong word, from third parties who may be part of your real-time service delivery process, that they have controls in place for a lot of different things, including business continuity and recovery. Put it in the contract, right? You have SLAs potentially with these vendors that require uptime. Put it in the contract. Force the issue with your vendors. Make sure that you have those conversations with them. It's part of the topic of vendor management. Due diligence with third parties is something you should be doing. If you have a procurement group in your company, make sure that procurement group includes in their questionnaire, hey, what is your policy for disaster recovery? How do you accomplish that? What should our expectation be for how quickly you're going to come up in case you have a disruptive event? The second thing you can do is, and I mentioned that a little earlier, is ask them for their compliance reports, right, that were done by a third party. It's really important that sometimes you get an independent assessment of their capability and you not just take their word for it. And the other thing I would say is a lot of times I recommend that you build into your contracts with your clients the ability to actually do an audit with them on a limited scale. We'll call it audit light, but you actually get to come in and you get to ask questions. You get to make them prove with evidence that they're actually operating their controls in a way that supports your goals as an organization because you've contracted with them to actually help operate and service deliver the things that you do.
That's great. Todd, the next one is, what do you suggest for finding new BCP DRP scenarios? We find it hard to think of new yet relevant scenarios at times as we have tested both plans each year.
If I'm understanding the question right, it's how do you refresh those and make them something different than the ones that you've already tested? Sometimes what I'll have clients do is start with a scenario that they've used before because it's so relevant to them and insert something new in the middle of it, right? I've got a ransomware scenario that I run sometimes, and the scenario doesn't demand any money. It just says, hey, we're going to shut you down, completely shut you down. You're not going to be able to do anything unless you drop your relationship with this company over here, right? It's really more of an activist kind of thing than it is about money. Well, maybe you can change the scenario the next year to say, oh, wait, the scenario started as an activist scenario and it's all of a sudden graduated to, oh no, now they are demanding money, right? Or you might change the scenario where the timeline they gave you gets compromised and they actually jump early. Some of those kind of things can be done with similar scenarios, just throw different tactics in there associated with it. The other thing I would say on business continuity scenarios is if you've been doing what I call white scenarios, where everybody knows the scenarios up front and they have all the details, that's not really real life, right? Do black scenarios, meaning nobody gets to know anything about the scenario until they sit down at the table to do the tabletop test. You can vary similar scenarios that are still relevant to you with throwing in some of those kind of things into the mix. That's also where maybe if you've got those scenarios that were lower on your risk profile that you've not dealt with, throw some of those in there. Another thing you can do is throw scenarios in there that you've not considered before. Fraud. Maybe you haven't ever considered a fraud scenario. What would you do in that scenario? Because that has implications beyond just disaster recovery, right? There's all kinds of things that could entail. Hopefully that kind of helps answer the question if I understood it correctly.
That's great. And the last one that we have is, you talked about single points of failure when it comes to people. Is there something you would recommend we do to identify who those people are?
Oh, everybody knows who those people are, right? Talk to the rank and file in the business if you don't know, because they know, I promise you. If you ever hear anybody talk about, well, go see him, he knows all about that. and you hear that about a person multiple times in multiple contexts, that's who those people are. Now, the way you solve that problem is with job sharing, right? Who picks up the work that that person does when they go on vacation, even if it's, at a less proficient level, right? Job sharing and split duties sometimes helps transfer that knowledge to other people, but you have to be very deliberate with that. Um, you have to do the two in a box thing that we've talked about in the consulting world, where a day in the life of, find somebody in your organization, especially if you've got maybe an older employee who knows all this stuff and you're worried about that person retiring, right? Normal succession planning, right? Make sure that you got somebody joined at the hip with that person at some point. And is that going to maybe compromise something else in the organization while you get that person up to speed with the person knows? Yeah, but that should all be in your risk assessment, right? You should have a way to deal with everything in that risk assessment, and you should have mitigations outlined for how to do that. And on the single point of failure front, it really is about that. Now, the other question you got to ask yourself is if that person knows that much and they're a single point of failure, do we have the right solution in place anyway? Right? That's another thing you need to ask yourself is that person so dependent on that solution that part of the delivery that I actually depend on them so much that maybe there's not a process change or technology change that I can make that makes me less dependent on that person.
That's great. That was the last question that we had. So if you go to the next slide, we've got our contact details. Just as a reminder, everyone will receive a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides. If you would like those should be in your inbox tomorrow. If you would like CPE credit, please email us, hello@kirkpatrickprice.com. We'd love to partner with you. So if there's anything we can do to help, please reach out. We are here to answer any questions that you have. Again, thank you for joining us today. We hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Take care.